In Japan, you can rent a friend, not a therapist, not a date exactly, not just a gig worker in the abstract. A friend, or at least someone who can show up in your life and perform that role for a while. Sometimes that means attending a wedding. Sometimes it means joining you for a social event. Sometimes it just means making sure you do not have to show up alone. And yes, that sounds like one of those stories the internet repeats because it feels too strange to be real. But the interesting question is not whether the friendship is fake. The interesting question is what the customer is actually trying to buy. Because if you look at the service as renting human connection, it sounds bleak and sensational. If you look at it as renting social presence, it starts to make more sense. And once it starts making more sense, it gets a lot more revealing. Friend rental services sit in a strange zone between companionship, performance, and logistics. The basic idea is simple. A customer books a person to appear in a specific role for a limited amount of time. That role might be friend, guest, listener, companion, plus one, or just someone who should be there. That distinction matters. The service is not always selling intimacy in the deep personal sense. Very often it is selling context. Think about the kinds of situations where presence changes the meaning of an event. Showing up alone to a wedding can feel very different from arriving with someone. A family conversation may go differently if there is another person in the room. A party, reunion, or public event can feel less exposing if you do not have to occupy the social space by yourself. And once you notice that, the service starts looking less like a bizarre fantasy and more like a paid answer to a familiar problem. Some situations become easier simply because another person is there. That is especially true when social life depends heavily on roles. Who came with you? Who can vouch for you? Whether you look isolated? Whether the moment appears stable, ordinary, or successful from the outside? This is where the topic becomes bigger than Japan is weird. Because plenty of societies already pay for emotional labor, image management, and event support. Friend rental just makes that logic unusually literal. So what are people actually booking? Start with the most obvious use case, social cover. Maybe you do not want to arrive somewhere alone. Maybe everyone else is bringing someone. Maybe the event itself is fine, but the optics of being by yourself feel worse than the event. In that scenario, the rented companion is not replacing a real friendship. They are reducing friction. Now take the family or relationship version. Some people need a witness, a buffer, or simply a calmer room. Another person can soften an interaction, fill awkward silence, help carry conversation, or make a tense meeting feel less confrontational. Again, the thing being purchased is not necessarily emotional closeness. It is atmosphere. Then there is the performance side. Some services can help create the appearance of normalcy, popularity, stability, or social integration. And that sounds cynical until you realize how much everyday life already runs on those signals. People read social proof constantly. Does this person seem supported? Do they seem connected? Do they seem like somebody others choose to be around? We like to pretend those signals do not matter, but in practice they shape everything from confidence to credibility to how exposed someone feels in a room. That is why the service can overlap with things that look completely different on the surface. Companion rental, event attendance, stand-in guests, even adjacent services like line standing or symbolic support all point toward the same underlying demand. Sometimes what people need is not labor alone. Sometimes they need a human presence that changes how a situation feels and how it is interpreted. And that is why calling this fake friendship is a little too simple. A fake friend suggests deception is the whole point. But in many cases, the more useful frame is role performance. A role is not necessarily false just because it is temporary. Wedding photographers are hired. MCs are hired. Hosts are hired. Event staff are hired. Consultants are hired to coach personality, image, and communication. What makes friend rental feel more unsettling is that it touches a part of life we want to believe should remain spontaneous. But spontaneity is not always what people are shopping for. Sometimes they are shopping for relief. Relief from embarrassment. Relief from exposure, relief from the burden of having to generate a socially reassuring scene all by yourself. And that is what makes this service easier to understand than people want to admit. Here is the twist. The real product is often not friendship at all. It is social infrastructure. A rented companion can function like portable normalcy, a witness, a plus one, a stabilizer, a social bridge, a person who makes an event feel less empty, less tense, less visibly precarious. That is a very different thing from the cartoon version of this story. The cartoon version says, "Look how lonely modern life has become." The more interesting version says, "Look how many parts of life depend on the presence of the right person at the right time." Once you see it that way, the service stops looking like a niche curiosity and starts looking like an unusually direct response to a common pressure. Modern life asks people to manage image, mood, confidence, and social proof all at once. Friend rental is one way of outsourcing part of that burden. Not because people are foolish enough to confuse a booking with a bond, but because sometimes a temporary role can solve a real problem. So yes, Japan has services where you can rent a friend. No, that does not mean friendship itself has turned into a vending machine. What it does mean is that social presence has value, enough value in some cases to become a service. And that is what makes this topic worth decoding. Not because it is dystopian by default, but because it reveals how often people are trying to buy something more specific than company. Context, cover, witness, ease, a little bit of borrowed normalcy. The weird headline is real, but the system underneath it is the real story.